All right, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom at NLIHC, and my clock is showing 3:01 in the PM. So we are going to get started with today's webinar. The topic for today is educating voters before Election Day. And this follows on the previous webinars that we've done on voter registration and candidate engagement and building up a good voter list. If we have a good set of voters who are ready to go and vote, it's only going to matter if they are informed voters on Election Day. First, let me talk about some logistics as we're getting started. One question we commonly get is, will there be a recording of today's webinar? There certainly will be, and the slides will be provided in an email that will be sent out shortly after we're done. Please know also, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. There's a questions box on the right-hand side of your screen in your control panel. Please feel free to submit questions there at any time during the webinar. We'll get to our question and answer period toward the end, and we really look forward to providing more information at that time. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, if your screen isn't showing up correctly, or if you're not hearing us quite right, please feel free to get in touch with Tori Beret, who's here with us and who is managing the questions queue. You can shoot Tori an email at vbore@nlihc.org. Her email address is right there on the screen. All right. So today, joining me will be Annie Logue of the League of Women Voters of Chicago, where she is president of the local league. And we're really, really happy to have a local perspective from an organization that's been dedicated to doing a lot of voter education in the recent past. Let's talk about voter education, though, and why it's important. So looking at reasons for not voting in the 2014 election, there are a lot of things that stand out as simple issues of I'm sorry, I think I'm on the wrong slide. Can we move back? I apologize. Yes, I apologize. Somehow my slides got out of order. So before I talk to you about reasons for not voting, we're just going to go over the agenda really quickly, which is we'll talk about knowing how to vote, some of the keys information for finding polling locations and so forth. We'll talk about defending against voter suppression, and then we're going to talk about the key pieces of knowledge that voters need as they head to the polls, and then closing on some additional resources. I always remind folks that Our Homes, Our Votes is a project from NLIHC that involves 3 components, and we are in the midst of the education component that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. We've already talked a lot about registration up there at the top, and then we'll cover mobilization in next week's webinar, and a lot of today's topics will really lead to that as well. So thanks so much for joining to consider that. But we do want to emphasize that these 3 aspects of a voter engagement campaign are important to your organization's work, not just today, but through ongoing operations. Things such as having voter guides or voter registration forms at intake desks, or constantly and continuously providing your residents or the people you serve at your agencies with opportunities to engage with elected officials and other key decision makers in public debate. A reminder, a quick slide that we include for every one of our webinars is that nonprofit organizations are allowed to participate in voter registration efforts and really all voter engagement. So on the left-hand box, you see some of the things that 501c3 organizations can do. That includes educating voters, which is today's topic. It includes getting voters to the polls, and something we'll expand on today, supporting ballot initiatives is something 501c3s can certainly do. As long as, if you look at the right-hand box, all of these activities are done in a way that is nonpartisan, that doesn't endorse or support a specific candidate or a specific party, or that doesn't coordinate with a specific candidate or a specific party. Okay, now we're going to get into the meat of our presentations after I so hurriedly skipped over some of our intro slides just a moment ago. Reported reasons for not voting in the 2014 elections. These are some of the most important things to keep in mind when engaging in voter education. You'll see the biggest, of course, is too busy, conflicting schedule. You look down just a little bit further from that, you'll see 10% of people who didn't vote didn't vote because they were out of town. Inconvenient polling place accounts for 2.3% of people who didn't vote in 2014. And sometimes people might not vote because of bad weather conditions or transportation problems. I call out these reasons specifically because we're now in a place where early voting and vote by mail are extremely common. More than 30 states have some version of early voting or vote by mail. And for voter mobilization, this can be a really important tactic. For educating voters, it's extremely important that your organization is aware of how early voting works in your state and what vote by mail options there are. We'll get into in just a moment where you can find that information, but it's important to start thinking about how we educate voters being not just the traditional how to vote on election day. Voting before election day is a significant and growing manner of civic participation. So let's talk about what people need to know in order to vote. It's somewhat simple in terms of the categories. One is polling locations, the open and closing times of those polling locations, what they need to bring with them, specifically knowing the ID requirements in a particular state, or if they're registering at the polls, what they need to bring to prove their residence and show that they live in a particular ward and are casting their vote in the correct district. And as I was just mentioning, voters need to know their options for mail-in ballots and for early voting. I'm going to quickly review the best resources for you to get this information so that you can begin distributing it to your network and to the low-income renters and other allies who you work with. The best place to start is Nonprofit Vote. They have a voting in your state resource, and we include the URL link on this page. I'm going to show you an example of one of those state pages in just a moment, but this is a great place to go to find a polling location, to know when polls open and close, and you can sort of find the links to the best information in a given state. In some cases, Nonprofit Vote will provide that information on the state page. In some cases, they'll encourage you to go to a link to, for example, the state's Board of Elections or Secretary of State's office that might have that information listed for your given state. They might also include the links to your county clerks and county offices, which will contain some of that information. We're also going to talk about address-based voter information that the League of Women Voters provides through vote411.org. And this is address-based because a person can simply put in their address and bring up all of the relevant information that they need for election day. So if you are a resident council working in a subsidized housing building, the fortunate story there is very often people in that building will all vote at the same location. If you're working more broadly, if you're working on a citywide voter engagement effort, then it might be important to contact local officials through the county clerk or Board of Elections to get a sense of where all the different polling locations are, so that as you go about your voter information campaign, you can be educating people on their specific polling locations, because ultimately not knowing where to vote is a significant barrier on election day, as we just talked about. So let's not imagine what voting in your state looks like at Nonprofit Vote. Here's an example. And today's example is Wisconsin because it's primary election day there. People throughout Wisconsin are heading to the polls. And for any individual who might be interested, there's all kinds of great information on Nonprofit Vote. You'll see the boxes on the right-hand side encourage people to find their particular state or local election offices. When you look further down, you'll see Find Your Polling Place. You'll see information about election day registration and information for people to check their registration prior to going to vote. On the left-hand side, for special circumstances, there are links for voting as an ex-offender, which comes up a lot for people who have previously served criminal sentences, and a reminder for everyone that voting in almost every state is legal for people with criminal convictions as long as they have completed their term of probation or parole. There's also a link on the left-hand side for voting and homelessness, and I'll offer another reminder that we explored on our voter registration webinar, which is just that people who don't have homes absolutely can still vote. That is still a right that they have, and that they simply need to provide proof of where they're living, whether it be a shelter or a park bench, and this can be established through someone vouching for them or through a letter from a homeless service agency. Much like polling locations or registration deadlines, aspects of voting as an ex-offender or voting in homelessness are varying from state by state. So this is a really great resource for you to use, the Voting in Your State guide at Nonprofit Vote. So that's where you can get some of the essential information on polling locations and polling hours. Let's start to talk a little bit about how this information is put into play, because when somebody arrives at a polling location, they need to know who to vote for. So let's talk about sample ballots. Generally, a sample ballot should show someone how to complete a ballot. And it gives people a concept of what a paper ballot will look like, but a good sample ballot also includes some thoughts and instructions for filling out ballots on electronic voting machines, which are becoming more and more prevalent throughout the country. Sample ballots should also list the elected positions that will be on the ballot in a given election. Different elections have different offices being filled. In Wisconsin, which is our example we were just looking at, the Supreme Court is elected in the spring, as is the mayor or the county executive in most communities. The state legislature and federal elections are obviously in the fall. Sample ballots should give some information about what those offices are and how those offices can impact the issue of affordable homes and ending homelessness. Sample ballots can also contain specific information about ballot initiatives and direct legislation questions that voters will be facing. Remember, as a 501c3, it is acceptable for your organization to have a position on a ballot initiative, as long as that position it fits within the organization's mission. So this is something that a 501c3 organization can legally have a position on. It's not like elections for particular offices where you have to remain nonpartisan and not endorse anyone. On ballot initiatives, you can have an official stance, and your sample ballots can indicate what that stance is. Let's take a look at how Vote 411 takes people through the process of finding out some key information about voting on election day and what a sample ballot might look like. So if you go to vote411.org, one of the really helpful tools is that you can search by state and topic. As you can see, this is just a screenshot of their website, and it gives you an opportunity to select on the right-hand side a state, and then on the left-hand side any number of topics, including polling locations, polling place details, early voting information, election dates, and candidate and ballot measure information, and so forth. You can select the state and apply that, and it'll get in there. What you'll see on your screen right now is on the left-hand side, I put in an address in Madison, Wisconsin, where I used to live, so that we could use that as our example. So once you put in your address on vote411.org, it gives you some really helpful information. You'll notice in this case, because we used Wisconsin as our example, there's a big red exclamation point encouraging everyone to get out and vote today. It also provides some information about, on the left-hand side in the bottom, the election date and the registration deadlines. And you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's an opportunity to verify your registration status. One of the things I really want to focus on today, though, is that in the voting, below the voting alert, there's information on local, state, and federal candidates and ballot measures that may be available by clicking at that link. That then takes you to the Vote 411 voter guide, where you can enter your address. And once you do enter your address, it'll show you the various races that are being considered in the election, which in Wisconsin is taking place today. So you'll see a whole menu of different races that a voter can take a look at. And if we take a look at lieutenant governor, for example, vote411.org is now giving us the various lieutenant governor candidates of their various parties. In some cases, these lieutenant governor candidates, you can see, submitted pictures. In other cases, they did not. Vote411.org makes it possible for people to then access information about questionnaire responses these candidates might have given. If the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin had done a questionnaire, I actually didn't check to see if that had occurred in this case. There is a comparison button, but this is where any given voter can get more information. Now, sometimes the depth and breadth of the information available will rely on the amount of capacity for a given statewide or local League of Women Voters. But for the most part, vote411.org really is one of the best places to go for this information. Now, back on the earlier page, when we found out where our polling location was and got the voting alert about elections today happening in Wisconsin, further down on that page, I put in a screenshot of some additional information that automatically pops up. One is upcoming debates and forums. This is really important for voters to get the information they need about the candidates, and promoting these debates and forums can be really helpful. Promoting the recordings of these debates and forums is also within your role to educate the community that you serve. In addition to the debates and forums, you'll see on the right, there are, again, additional links and resources, the poll locator, information about absentee voting, voter registration, and so forth. So that's some information about what people need to know as they prepare to go vote, why it's so important, and how nonprofitvote.org as well as vote411.org can be used as essential resources in putting that information together. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Annie Logue from the League of Women Voters of Chicago to share a little bit of a case study of what they do to use this information and to try to generate larger voter turnout and better voter participation. So Annie, if you're with us, I think we've unmuted you, and I'd love it if you could take it away.
Hi, how are you?
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So, it's been very interesting to be part of the League in the last, shall we say, almost 2 years, because I think people are realizing that this nuts and bolts citizenship stuff really matters. The League's goal, the League's purpose is to promote active citizenship, and we are nonpartisan. We do not support or oppose candidates, although we often do have positions on different issues. So that's just the basic background. Key things to know for voter registration. Some of this varies from state to state, and that's one of the things that we think is interesting. It's also something that makes voting very complicated. But for the most part, you register based on where you currently live. You can register online. You can register on election day. But where you currently live issue is really important, and we spend a lot of time at voter turnout events updating addresses much more than we do registering voters. You must be a US citizen. And here's a fun fact, something that we have learned to be very careful of recently, especially when we're doing high school voter registration activities, is if you are not a US citizen, regardless of your legal status, you may not vote. And if you register and if you vote, you can be deported no matter how legal your status is. And we have to be careful in high schools because students sometimes don't know their status, or they get so carried away because their friends are registering. However, if a non-citizen registers to vote accidentally, they can go down to your local board of elections and file a form to rescind that registration. And if they do that before election day, they will be safe. So I think if you're dealing with a population where their status is in question, you need to know that. The other thing about voter ID is that does vary a great deal from place to place, and you should take the time to find out what your local requirements are. In Illinois, you do not normally need to show ID, but you may need to show ID the first time that you vote. You often hear people will do these stunt things where they'll get a motor voter form and register their dog, and they'll claim that's an example of voter fraud. But it's only actually voter fraud if that person votes. If the dog votes, it's voter fraud. The dog should not be able to show government ID to vote that first time. So I have lots of fun statistics about voter turnout that can give you some perspective on the issue. This was research done in 2016 based on that presidential election. The Pew Research Center and the US Census Department do a big overview of voting trends in each presidential election. One of the most interesting things is that the Black voter turnout declined sharply in 2016, and we can hypothesize all sorts of reasons for it. But one of the key things we note is that white people in general vote more than Black people, that wealthy people vote more than poor people, and that old people vote more than young people. And we think that that's something that, every now and then people say, why should I vote? It doesn't matter. But the fact of the matter is, the Koch brothers vote. They give a lot of money, but they vote too. And if voting didn't matter, why would a billionaire care? So I have all these great data, and this is specific to Chicago, but I'm going to walk you through this. So this first slide here has turnouts for city elections since 2012. And the really interesting thing is that tends to be very low. 2015, we had a mayoral election. It was Rahm Emanuel was running for office. He's a national figure, and he had actually had opponents. And despite this, turnout was really, really low. In 2016, the reasons that people said they didn't vote was that they didn't like the candidates. But we think that there's a lot of reasons for why there's disengagement. That was a major one in 2016 for the presidential. The too busy or conflicting thing, we know that that's an issue, and we think that's why it's really important to emphasize early voting and vote by mail. When you get into some issues about why people are disengaged, we think a lot of it is just getting people to understand what real activism is, that you have a stake in the system, even if your preferred candidate does not win. And that you need to engage with elected officials, not with your friends on Facebook. Um, that you need to take the time to find out who's running, to go to meet your city council person, to go to ward night, to send letters, to attend rallies, to make sure people know that you are there. And that you actually care. So we think that that's something that people really need to click into. When we talk about the things that we do to do that, the voter service or the voter registration is what we're known for, but we spend a lot of time just distributing basic information. We give out these bookmarks that have a lot of detailed information about all the different deadlines for voter registration and for when early voting starts and things like that. But because there's a lot of little details to it, that ends up being pretty valuable. The way to think about it is this is a mission critical event for our democracy that happens very seldom. And so there's a lot of little details that all come together. And if you know those details, they can be used for good or for bad. So sometimes the people that you think will have the most accurate information don't. There are a lot of elected officials who do not want high voter turnout, that understanding all of these deadlines and grace periods and registration at the polls, that information can increase access to the ballot to some people, but all of those little details can also be used to deny access to the ballot. One of the big things that we really suggest is, even though you can register at the polls in many states, you should register in advance. You don't want to be that person holding up the line with a poll worker who may not be fully trained or even fully awake, given how early the polls open. Also, to really push early voting and vote by mail. We always joke here in Illinois that the chances of a snowstorm on pretty much any day of the year are not zero. Maybe they're zero on August 14th, but pretty much, weather's a problem. Weather's a problem in many parts of the country. And so if you make the time to vote, you make the appointment, you make it intentional, and you can do it on your schedule instead of trying to rush into the polling place before you pick your kids up from school or slog through the snow or the rain to get to your polling place. And so that is something that we really want to emphasize as people think about this. Um, yeah, and in terms of giving presentations and candidate forums, we do a lot of candidate forums. We have noticed a big pickup in interest in candidate forums, and that might be something that your organization would want to do. The League of Women Voters will do them. We're happy to do them if we can work out a time on the schedule. Our main requirement is that they fairly represent all of the people who are running those. So if there's 2 candidates on the ballot, they both have to be there. If there's 5 candidates, we could do it with only 3 or 4, but we would want to make sure that everybody's invited. So we do have some rules about how they're run to make sure that they are fair and nonpartisan, but we are always looking for people who want to work with us. And my guess is that wherever you live, your local league would be in a very similar situation. We are, historically, the League of Women Voters is very much an organization of very well educated, very white, very middle class women. But I know that at least in Chicago and I believe in most of the country, we are trying really hard to engage with broader populations so that, we want everyone, every citizen to be an informed and active participant in government. And so that would apply to your constituencies all the way throughout your community. And so with that, I believe my section is over here. Yes, no?
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie, for sharing that perspective and for giving people a sense of how your League of Women Voters is doing this important voter education work at the local level. For those of you attending the webinar today, Annie will be available for questions here at the end of the session, along with myself. So please feel free to put questions in the questions box. For right now, I want to talk a little bit about defending against voter suppression. One of the things that Annie mentioned was that voter ID laws are becoming a lot more prevalent because of a lot of concern about potential voter fraud. What this has led is specific state legislation throughout the country that is making access to the ballot more restricted, specifically for people who are new or young voters, people who are elderly, who may have lost their voter IDs or may not regularly re-register and check their registration, and specifically people of color or renters who find themselves more commonly than others moving and needing new IDs and so forth. A lot of voter suppression that's been happening has been in the law, but some of it is just misinformation, right? So what we need to do as advocates who are working with low-income renters and working in low-income communities is make sure first that everyone has the necessary information on voter ID requirements. And we showed you earlier in this webinar the best places to go for that information. Nonprofitvote.org or vote411.org. Putting in your state and location will get you to the information that you need to be able to provide this to people in your network. The second thing that's important for defending against voter suppression is making sure that everyone who shows up to vote does fill out a ballot. And when I say everyone, I mean all caps everyone. Everyone needs to vote. And specifically, I'm referring to what are called provisional ballots. very often when a voter is challenged at a polling location, if they are in the correct polling location, they can cast what's called a provisional ballot that will be counted in the event that the race is very close. So whenever there's a recount, they go through not only the votes that were cast at the polling location and the votes that were cast as early voting and vote by mail, but then they also start to go through the provisional ballots, and they look into, in each individual case, whether or not a provisional ballot should be allowed based on the information that was provided that day. So if you're confident that the voters who you are mobilizing have the correct information, that they're in the right place, and that they're being challenged illegally or unjustly, they should make sure to cast a provisional ballot. If they're not being allowed a provisional ballot or a regular ballot, and this is happening in a way that is illegal or unjust, the important thing to do is use the hotlines, specifically the Election Protection Hotline. This is a number that's being distributed by the American Civil Liberties Union about access to the ballot. You'll see it's 1-866-OUR-VOTE or 888-1888 VEI VOTA, which is the Spanish version of the hotline. And then also the U.S. Department of Justice has their own voting rights hotline that can be used. But the final point on this slide is probably the most important one. When it comes to voter suppression, the best defense is a good offense, right? The voters who feel confident in the information that they have when they arrive at their polling location are the voters who are hardest to intimidate and turn away. Because very often when someone gets challenged, they don't have the correct ID, that they don't have the correct proof of residence, oftentimes they're not going to go home, get what they need, and go vote. They're just going to quit, right? If voters have the information they need ahead of time, they are dramatically more likely to resist efforts of voter intimidation and to push through that and cast their vote on election day. Best defense is a good offense also refers to working against misinformation campaigns. There are very famous examples of flyers being passed around in low-income communities, giving the wrong date for the election, so that people go out and show up to vote the day after the election occurred and so forth, or giving the wrong times for the poll hours and so forth. If people have the correct information, they won't be as disrupted by this misinformation and those types of campaigns. So let's talk about informing the voters on issues. So far, we've talked a lot about how to vote and having confidence that your vote will be counted when you go to the polls. What does it take to be an informed voter? Voter guides are a really important tool, and these are similar to the sample ballots that I showed you earlier from the vote411.org website. Essentially, a voter guide seeks to provide voters with general information on each of the candidates and the offices that those candidates will fill. One of the things that you heard Annie mentioning is candidate forums and debates. These are becoming more common events for nonprofit organizations to be involved in. And this is an opportunity for candidates to express their feelings on issues that you care about. We covered this in great detail last week in our candidate engagement webinar, and I encourage you to look at that recording for a broad explanation. But one of the things we talked about in great detail was candidate surveys, and how organizations such as yours can be sending surveys out to candidates to ask them how they feel about those issues that are most important to you. Candidate survey answers are important to consider including in voter guides. The importance is making sure that every candidate has an opportunity to submit an answer so that the voter guide isn't seen as an effort toward partisan or political participation on your part. Some things to consider for voter guides are that they can include general candidate information such as the name, the website, the party affiliation, contact information, and so forth. Just remember not to coordinate with the candidate or their campaign when collecting this information. Only take information that is publicly available. You know, you can find it on their website. That's not coordinating with the campaign. Publicly available information you can certainly distribute in any voter guide. Remember again that 501c3 organizations can take official positions on ballot initiatives, and in fact your organization should do so if the particular ballot initiative impacts your mission and the community that you serve. So with doing information on candidates, as I mentioned, survey responses are a really essential tool, but be careful about picking and choosing quotes because this can be a partisan practice, right? So if both candidates provided 4-paragraph answers on a particular issue related to affordable housing, it can be perceived as partisan if you're choosing a particularly positive quote from one candidate or a particularly critical quote from another candidate. So to the extent that you have spaced considerations in a flyer or voter guide you're putting together, be sure that you're coming up with a standard for being impartial in selecting how you will reflect their positions. By far the best practice for distributing candidate positions is to distribute them in their entirety. And this is why often it's good to ask a candidate a 2-part question. One, which is almost yes or no and has a short answer, and then allowing them to expand on that answer with their thoughts and vision. That way, if you're doing your website and you're not restricted by space, you can put their whole answer. If you're producing a flyer or a letter as part of your voter guide, then you can sort of use the shorter option. For the most part, the safest approach is to always produce the candidates' responses in their own words. When you're directing voters to candidate resources and providing websites or candidate flyers, just make sure to include all candidates. For example, it wouldn't even be a violation for you to have information about a candidate in your homeless shelter or in your community center or in your resident services area. It would only be partisan and a violation of your 501c3 status if you had flyers for only one of the candidates, right? So if any given race wants the votes of your community and they leave a stack of flyers, that's fine. You just have to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to do that so that you're distributing the information in a nonpartisan manner. So that's the crux of our information for you today. It seems like this has been one of our quickest webinars in terms of content. We're often running out right at the hour, but I'd like to at this point throw it open and see if anyone has questions up to now.
Yes.
Tori, what questions do we have?
Yes, so we have a lot of good questions coming in. The first question we have is, how do you address misinformation being stated during candidate forums, especially when candidates are addressing low-income seniors?
So this is a great question, and it's something that we covered a little bit in last week's webinar on engaging candidates. I think the best way to correct misinformation is to use the communication tools that you have available to you. And generally, I'd say correcting the record is the best approach. Providing a response that's considered just engaging in the debate and trying to prove that a candidate is wrong in their opinion can sometimes be a little bit difficult. But if a candidate is wrong in a matter of fact, please, yes, engage and correct the record. Now, there's several ways you can do that. You can live tweet at the event, use your Twitter account and say, this individual just put out this information, it's incorrect. Our data and our experience working with seniors indicates, this is a greater need for housing in our community, might be one example. You could also, if your web space has a blog, you can write about it there. But I would also encourage you to consider submitting op-ed pieces or letters to the editor in local newspapers that would correct the record of a candidate's misstatement. And I think you'll find during elections, the op-eds and letters to the editor that you submit have a better chance of being printed because they're considered particularly newsworthy and in response to something that people have been talking about throughout the community. So I think the best way to respond is to do so publicly and using various communications channels to do so. If you're asking this question in a more immediate context, how do I correct someone at a candidate forum who's just wrong? I mean, I think it would depend on the way audience participation is set up. If there's a Q&A at the end and you can get to the microphone, that's a great option. But oftentimes interrupting in the midst of the statement might be seen as a little bit obstructionist. So what other questions do we have?
Yep. How common is it that Vote 411 compiles candidate forums?
I believe it's pretty common. Annie, do you know how often Vote 411 will have that information for given states?
Vote 411 will often have it, but not all not all leagues have the capacity to contribute to it or to keep it highly customized. In Illinois, we actually have a system called Illinois Ballot Guide, illinoisballotguide.org. But a lot of it just depends on people keeping the information up to date. And so that's kind of the bad news. The candidates who are participating in forums will be happy to tell you that they are. There's sometimes a lot more enthusiasm for organizing forums than there are candidates interested in participating. You know, it's like everybody in Chicago right now wants to do a mayoral forum, even though our mayoral election isn't until February. And I can tell you that Rahm Emanuel will do as few as possible. And I think that that's not a partisan statement. That's how his
Yeah,
campaign
we're ignoring
tactics.
it.
And that's kind
Yeah,
of the thing that you start to see.
we'll email
So
Minash later.
Vote 411 should be pretty good. But if you're looking for more information, start talking to the candidates, and they can give you some good information.
Thanks, Annie. That's really great information. Any other questions?
Yes, so we have Missouri implemented photo ID last year. We can still vote without a photo ID if we have another acceptable form of ID and sign an affidavit that we are who we say we are. I possess both the photo ID and a non-photo ID that both meet the requirements. Would you advise that I use the non-photo ID to kind of make sure at least my polling location is properly allowing and facilitating this kind of ID? I heard others say that on the primary election day earlier this month, election judges insisted on photo IDs from others at the polls.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Annie.
No, what I was going to say, one big issue is the quality of poll workers. And we have all had the experience of, it's sort of like there are people who do it because they've always done it and they think that they know everything because they've always done it. And they often don't. That's a fact. There are people for whom that $120 a day or whatever for a 16-hour day is a decent paycheck. And there are people who do it because they're passionate about the process or the civic duty or whatever. One thing that we are really trying to emphasize is that if you are interested, if you know people who would be good, encourage them to volunteer as a poll worker. And you really have to think of it as a volunteer gig with a little stipend, because again, the money for most people, it's pretty close to minimum wage by the time all is said and done. So that is an issue. I think testing of the poll workers, that's going to be a tough one, because again, their training is all over the place and their own personal biases are all over the place. I would say if you want to do that, try to do it at a time when the polls are less crowded, so that you don't become the jerk holding up the line for everybody else trying to vote. And I also think one advantage of early voting is that the poll workers tend to be very well trained and that they're there for several days, and so that they often have a better understanding of all of the processes. And so if you have a population or you have a group of people that you know are more likely to have a problem than others, that is another reason to encourage early voting, or quite frankly, vote by mail. You often do not have to go through the same hoops for ID for vote by mail that you do to vote in person, which, by the way, we at the League of Women Voters think is quite ironic, because most voter fraud is related to absentee ballots, and it is related to zealous political campaign workers who do things like assist residents of a dementia wing at a nursing home with their absentee ballots. And we all know that goes on, and it goes on particularly in elections, especially special elections that are likely to have low turnout. So, again, if you're looking at people in your population, you may have a sense of whether they're more likely or less likely to have an ID problem. Um, I think it's fair to document if you have any suspicions that something is not right. Document it, notify your local board, notify whoever the ombudsmen are in your area. But yeah, the quality of poll workers is an issue. And if you're going to test poll workers, you know, they might not know, or they might be partisan. It's hard to say. And the
Thanks for
party,
that answer,
just as
Annie.
another aside, and just kind of going off, this is one of the downsides of League people. We know too much of this little minutia. But the party on the poll workers ID or on their name tag may not actually be the party that they represent. So, for example, in Chicago, where the Republican Party is not particularly large or active, but there's a requirement that there be a Republican poll worker at every poll. Pretty much new poll workers will be assigned as Republican judges. So just assuming that if you find a judge who has a sticker that identifies that person with one party or another means that they might be more or less sympathetic to you is not a fair assumption.
That's a great note, and thanks for all that additional information about poll workers. I'm actually going to use this moment to pursue another aside that we haven't talked about on this webinar, which is just if your organization wants to have more of a presence at the polls, one thing you might consider is actually becoming a polling place and working in consideration with future elections to make sure that your residents or your community or your neighborhood can vote at your location. Then it can be easier for you to be there when there are issues such as what might come up in Missouri if people are using the non-photo ID option. Tori, do we have any other questions?
Yes. How do you discuss issues without being partisan? It seems tricky.
I think it's something that we do all the time here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We are a 501c3 organization, but our mission is to ensure that the poorest and most low-income people throughout the country have affordable, accessible, safe, decent homes, right? So that's our mission, and we can comment on any number of issues that relate to that mission. So whether it's the federal budget or tax reform, if it has an impact on the people we serve, it's our duty to comment on that, right? So I think it's really easy to talk about issues. It's difficult when you connect those issues to candidates, right? And that's why the candidate survey is an opportunity to give them the space to express their own thoughts, right? So it's easy for us at NLIHC to say, we believe in expanded funding for the National Housing Trust Fund. It's really problematic as a 501c3 to say, we believe in expanded funding for the National Housing Trust Fund, and that's why you should go vote for this candidate instead of this one. So that's kind of where the line is. Talking about the issues makes a lot of sense. You can say, in preparation for a given city council race, it's fair to include a couple of paragraphs about inclusionary zoning and then indicate to voters that the candidates they select will have an impact on what the city council does moving forward on this issue, right? And then as long as you're not connecting it to the candidate, you're going to be fine. Annie, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, and I'll add a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that the parties change over the years, and so, you don't necessarily want to be aligned with one or the other because they might be your friend this year, but they might not in a few years. And when you start talking about a lot of local elections one of the things that we talk about now is how this country has become very partisan, but in many local communities, there is only one party or the other that is basically in charge. But there's you still have positions and you're still advocating for it. In the city of Chicago, the city of Chicago is dominated by the Democratic Party, but there are at least three and maybe four viable, identifiable factions of the Democratic Party, and they do not agree with each other. And you want to be able to talk to everybody, because if you want to get your so much of this is local. You want to get your issue through city council, through city zoning, through city planning. You need to be able to talk to everybody. And so having that nonpartisan position is helpful. One other thing that we in the League in Chicago, we have done a ton of work on governance of the Chicago public school system. And that's a system with 400,000 students. 75% are low income, 90% are racial or ethnic minorities. And the way that it's situated is there's a lot of oversight that's handled by the state legislator. And you talk to state legislators who are from towns in downstate Illinois that don't even have as many people as some of our schools have students. And we have to be able to go and talk to these people and explain to them what the issues are in Chicago and what the alternatives are for the governance of large urban public school systems, because they don't know. And the fact that we are nonpartisan gives us a lot of credibility in being able to go in and, explain to somebody from Belleville or Effingham or towns that are much, much smaller, and tell them what some of the considerations are for a system this large. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind as you think about being nonpartisan, that it's easy to look at what's happening in Washington and decide that you should take a side. But when you're actually talking about the local stuff, about how the sausage gets made, it's helpful to be able to talk to a lot of people.
Thanks, Annie. Any more questions in the questions queue, Tori?
Yes. So how strong does the connection to mission need to be to take a stance on a ballot initiative? For example, with the fair tax in Illinois, that affects all nonprofits because of funding. So who could take a position? Thanks.
This is Joey. I would say any organization that supports programs that are funded through taxes in Illinois. That one actually doesn't seem like much of a stretch to me, though this is something of like once we start wandering into a gray area where, does it relate to your mission? I do think taxes relate to the strength of programs, so that's an easy one. Maybe an example of something that would be harder would be a ballot initiative on, for example, maybe you're a public housing resident advisory board, and you have some strong opinions about bus routes. But actually, that's not even a good example, because that would be a pretty direct link as well. I guess I would say there can be some gray areas here, but I think anything that relates to the people you serve, you should be able to comfortably weigh in on. I don't know if you agree with that, Annie.
No, I would agree with that. I think, we in the League are in favor of the fair tax too. But I mean, you look at some of the things on the ballot, it's like, well, should you take a position on rent control? Maybe. Should you take a position on marijuana legalization? Maybe. Should you take a position on term limits for the mayor? That's probably more of a stretch. That starts to look like something that's more partisan, or that's more targeting a specific candidate. So yeah.
Thanks, Annie. I think we have two more questions, Tori.
Yeah, so this question was about how do you approach people who have little presence on social media and who do get involved in real movements, yet they don't vote?
I think that's a really great question. I've definitely interacted with a lot of these people who believe that voting is not necessarily the most important action to bring about change. And guess what? They're right. There are a lot of actions that are necessary to bring about change. And I think the best way to describe voting, and I think, Annie, you actually said this earlier, is that voting is the first step. It's the first thing you do, right? And so I think there have been so many close elections recently that have really shown some stark contrast between the two candidates, that it's really hard for anyone to argue that voting doesn't make a difference. For those people who do make that argument, I usually try to remind them of all the issues that they care about that are impacted by the offices that are going to be elected, and try to work through those issues to get them to a place where they feel comfortable doing the bare minimum, which is voting.
I think I'll add to that. When you start crunching the numbers in Chicago, so say for the last mayoral election, the ward that had the highest turnout is a neighborhood called Beverly, which is on the southwest side, and it is predominantly where police officers, firefighters, city employees live. And it had the highest voter turnout far and away. And the ward that had the lowest voter turnout is West Englewood, which is high crime, high poverty, high minority population, which doesn't mean as much in Chicago as it might mean in other places, but high crime, high poverty, very low turnout. And if you look at the roots of the whole Laquan McDonald situation, that's where it was. The mayor doesn't know if all of the police and firefighters voted for him, but he knows that they vote. And the mayor doesn't know if poor Black people in West Englewood support him, but he knows that they don't vote. And for a lot of elected officials, when it comes to something on the margin like that, they're going to go with the people who are likely to vote for them. Voters are not the same people as citizens, and citizens are not the same people as residents of a community. And getting people to understand that connection, that their votes make a difference, that you have a little more power if you can go in and say that you vote, that you do all of the other things too. But that's a good starting point, and that's a way to start getting people to pay attention. And it does come down to turnout, and a lot of these issues for turnout are based on a lot of one-to-one conversations, explaining to people what their rights are, explaining to people what their ID requirements might be, explaining to people what the dates are and the times and those regulations. And I think we sometimes forget, when you talk about an age of social media and mass communications, and that all of these things seem to be in the ether all the time, people often don't know. They're often too busy with their own lives and just the stuff of work and kids and doctors and figuring out what you're going to make for dinner, that some of this drops off the list. But if you can, voting is your starting point. You're going to have a lot more credibility going in and talking to whoever your local officials are, or your state officials, or your national officials, if you can bring votes. And we think so much about how important money is, but we've seen in many cases where the candidate who raises the most money isn't the one who wins. And we saw that in the 2016 presidential election. It starts to come out to turn out in places that matter. So, and then you start to see how winners will cater specifically to the people they think will vote for them. So.
All right, thanks so much, Annie. I really appreciate that. So a little bit ago, I theorized that we might be ending this webinar early, but you all had so many great questions. Thank you for those. Tori tells me there was one more question about, are there sample scripts 501c3s can use to talk about issues while remaining nonpartisan? Generally, there aren't. There are guidelines more so than scripts, and there are various places you can find those. Nonprofitvote.org is one of the best. And that can be a really good resource to consider. For those of you who have additional questions, put them in the questions box, and we'll respond with emails after this session. I want to finish just by showing you a couple of additional resources that you can use as you consider electoral engagement in your community and working with your own clients and residents. The first is the sort of the oldest tools we have here at NLIHC that we've been using for years, and those are the voter engagement guide and the voter engagement plan. The guide document on the left is sort of a description of what a good voter engagement campaign looks like, and it includes a lot of the information that we've given to you today. The voter engagement plan is on the right, and that's more of a step-by-step question and answer sheet that you can use to plan out your voter engagement efforts. Where would you find those documents is a good question. Well, fortunately, they live on our new website, the ourhomes-ourvotes.org website. This was launched just a couple of weeks ago, and we're looking at all times for more content to load up there and more tools to provide. But this is a good place to find infographics and images, articles and spotlights, and of course, recordings of these excellent webinars. Speaking of which, hey, there's one more. I mentioned that we have a series of 6 webinars. This was number 5, and next week is number 6. We will talk about voter mobilization and getting out the vote. Our guest presenters come to us from Coalition on Housing and Homelessness in Ohio. Maria Bruno will be joining us. And then we also have a guest presenter from Arlington Partners for Affordable Housing here in Virginia. For those of you who are interested in the webinars that I was mentioning earlier that we've already done, please take a look on the website. When you go to webinars, you'll be able to find recordings and slides that you might use. Last bit of information, NLIHC is a membership organization, and if you're not a member, please do consider becoming one. We have individual and organizational members, government agencies can be members, and we really do rely on your support. Our Homes, Our Votes is an example of a project we work on where we don't have a grant or any funding that supports it. It really is just supported by our membership. And then finally, here's the contact information for myself and for Annie. Phone numbers, emails, Twitter handles. Please do take a look, and if you have further questions or if you want some additional guidance, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And so with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. It's really been a great session today, and we'll be in touch with a recording and the slides very shortly. Have a great day.